Today, I want to talk about global storage in a way that is useful for both technical teams and business leadership. A lot of storage conversations will start with capacity, performance, and cost. Those things will matter, of course, but they are no longer the whole story. The real question now is this: how do you place data, metadata, keys, logs, backups, and operational control in the right places around the world while still delivering the speed, flexibility, and resilience that your business expects? That is what has changed. Global storage is no longer just a back-end infrastructure topic. It is now an architecture decision, a risk decision, and in many cases, a market entry decision. And that is why I wanted to frame this as one global conversation instead of a per region one, because that is exactly how executive teams actually think about it. They're not asking for a separate storage philosophy for every geography. They're asking how to build once, operate globally, and still respect local requirements without slowing the business down. So that is the lens that I will use today. I will stay practical. I will keep this grounded in real operating choices, and I will also connect it back to how NetActuate thinks about global infrastructure, local control, and performance at the edge. I'm going to move pretty quickly through 6 sections. First, why the storage conversation changed. Second, the language problem, because a lot of teams still mix up residency, sovereignty, compliance, and performance, and that leads to bad decisions very early. Third, the global rulebook and why it now affects architecture choices on every continent, even if your company does not think of itself as highly regulated. Fourth, the design patterns that let you stay fast while still respecting local requirements. Fifth, where NetActuate fits in this market and why I think this is a good moment for a more open and globally distributed approach. And then finally, I will close with a practical checklist you can use with your own team. My goal here is not to turn this into a legal seminar. My goal is to give you a clear operating model you can take back to your engineering, product, legal, and executive teams. And then we'll have time at the end for questions. The easiest way to think about this slide is that the design center moved. It moved from capacity and cost to control and survivability. And there were really 4 forces behind that shift. The first is distributed workloads. More applications are now running close to users across regions and in mixed environments. That includes SaaS platforms, media pipelines, security services, analytics services, systems and services, and increasingly, of course, AI and inference at the edge. The second force is regulatory fragmentation. Rules are not only more visible now, they're more enforceable, more specific, and more likely to affect how you design storage, failover, and operations. The third force is cost pressure. A lot of organizations are taking a harder look at what belongs in a centralized cloud model, what belongs near users, and what belongs in a more flexible global platform. So placement decisions are getting revisited. And the fourth is resilience. Resilience is no longer just an operations discussion. It is a board level discussion. Customers ask about it. Regulators ask about it. Auditors ask about it. And when a failure happens, people very quickly want to know where the data was, what moved, who had access, and what the recovery path looked like. So storage can no longer be treated as a quiet back-end utility. It shapes customer experience. It shapes legal exposure. It shapes your recovery posture. And it shapes how much freedom the business actually has as it grows. That is why I think this topic now belongs in a broader business and architecture conversation, not just a storage team conversation. I always slow down here because this is where a lot of strategy discussions go wrong. These 4 terms are not the same thing. Residency is where data is physically stored. Sovereignty is a broader concept. It's about jurisdiction, control, and who can access, compel, decrypt, or administer that data. Compliance is the proof that your architecture, your operations, and your contracts actually line up with the rule set you are subject to. And performance is the real-world outcome: latency, throughput, availability, and recovery behavior. Those sound simple, but teams still blur them together all the time. They'll say things like, our data is stored locally, so we are fine. But then the key management is somewhere else, or the logs are going somewhere else, or support access crosses borders, or the failover plan moves data into a location the business never intended to use. So solving for residency alone does not solve the real problem. And that's one of the core ideas in this webinar. Because once you separate these four concepts, you can start making better design decisions. You can say, this workload needs local residency. This one needs stronger sovereign controls. This one needs a compliance trail that we can prove to a customer or regulator. And this one needs sub-second performance in multiple markets. That is a much better way to think about global storage than just asking what region to click on in a portal. This is the reason I prefer one global webinar over one per region. The point is not to memorize every law. The point is to understand that every major geography now shapes storage architecture in a different way. North America has an accountability model in places like Canada, stronger provincial requirements in places like Quebec, and then a more fragmented US environment driven by sector, customer type, and state-level rules. Europe continues to push the hardest on cross-border transfers, operational resilience, cyber obligations, and portability. So if you serve customers there, architecture choices get inspected through a different lens. South America is becoming more mature and more formal, especially with Brazil continuing to clarify and strengthen transfer and privacy expectations. Across Asia, you have a mix of stricter local handling expectations, more explicit transfer pathways, and stronger sensitivity around control. India matters, China matters, Singapore matters, but each in a different way. Africa is important as well, especially as organizations expand into new markets and realize that cross-border handling, privacy obligations, and local trust requirements are not just an EU or a US issue. And in Oceania, accountability for overseas handling remains a central idea. So the takeaway is not that every region needs a separate platform. The takeaway is that the global platform has to be flexible enough to honor local constraints. That is the shift. A single giant backend may still be efficient on paper, but the moment someone asks where the data, metadata, keys, logs, and support paths actually live, the conversation gets much more complicated. And that is exactly why architecture needs to become policy aware from the beginning. This is probably the most important slide in the whole deck. The control plane is the new border. And what I mean by that is simple. A lot of organizations still focus on where the primary data copy lives. That matters, but it's only part of the story. The real sovereignty risk often sits somewhere else. It sits in the metadata plane. It sits in key management. It sits in backup and disaster recovery. It sits in logs and observability. It sits in administrative access and support workflows. It sits in the tools that you use to inspect, troubleshoot, and recover the environment. So if I were to asking 3 practical questions on this slide, they would be these. Where does each data layer live? Who can reach it? And what happens to it when something fails? That is the discipline global teams need now, because a local storage copy does not automatically mean local control, and a local application does not automatically mean local operations. This is why I like the phrase, residency is where data sleeps, but sovereignty is who can wake it up. That tends to make the point very quickly. Once you see the system in layers, you stop treating this like a storage bucket problem and start treating it like an operating model problem. And that is exactly where the best architecture decisions come from. Now, let's make this practical. Not every workload needs the same sovereignty design. That is where teams sometimes overreact. They assume the answer is one universal architecture, or one universal restriction model, or a totally separate stack per market. Usually, that's not the best answer. So I like to frame this in 4 patterns. The first is a global namespace with regional placement. That means the user experience looks global, the product feels unified, but the data is placed and retained by region. That is often a very strong pattern for customer-facing platforms. The second is sovereign selves by market or jurisdiction. That means specific geographies get stronger boundaries around storage, policy, access, and recovery. This is useful when a customer contracts or local requirements are more demanding. The third is local hot data with selective replication. So you keep the right path and the high-value operational data close to the user or inside the region, and then you replicate only what is permitted and useful. That is often a much more efficient pattern than trying to replicate everything everywhere. And the fourth is stronger control models around keys, administration, and audit. Sometimes the real issue is not where the bits are stored. Sometimes the issue is who can administer the environment, how the keys are handled, and whether you can prove that access boundaries are actually enforced. The big point here is that a media workload, a SaaS control plane, an AI data service, and a backup repository may all need different answers. So the right strategy is not to globalize all data. The right strategy is to globalize policy, orchestration, and visibility while localizing the state that truly needs to stay local. One of the strongest narrative points in the webinar is this: compliance should change the architecture. It should not kill the user experience. Too many teams treat locality and sovereignty as a performance tax. They assume that if they have to honor regional requirements, they are automatically going to get worse latency, more operational pain, and less flexibility. That does not have to be true. A better operating model is straightforward. Write local, serve close to users, replicate selectively, design lawful failover paths ahead of time, and keep automation, policy, and performance as consistent as possible across environments. That is how you preserve speed without losing control. And this is where open tooling and portable operations really matter. If every region or platform forces you into a different operating model, then the compliance cost goes way up. But if your deployment approach, your APIs, your automation, and your observability remain consistent, then the operational burden becomes much more manageable. That is one of the reasons I think that openness matters so much in this conversation. Because the more portable your operations are, the less painful it becomes to make better placement decisions over time. And honestly, that is what a mature global architecture should look like. Not a rigid environment that only works one way, but a flexible system that can adapt as workloads, costs, and rules change. This is where I shift from industry framing to the NetActuate point of view. What matters to me here is that the story is bigger than storage alone. NetActuate is not just saying, here's another storage product. Our company is connecting network reach, open infrastructure operations, hybrid choice, anycast experience, and now globally deployable storage in one operating model. That matters because global storage does not live in isolation. It lives inside of compute decisions, network decisions, observability decisions, and support decisions. And when you look at the public proof points, the direction is very clear. There is a global reach across dozens of markets. There is a storage story that includes block, object, and custom models. There's an open platform story with one, our open network edge, where API-driven and automation-friendly deployment matters. And there are regional examples that make this concrete. Mumbai and Chennai matter for performance, hybrid deployment, and data residency conversations in India. Singapore matters for Southeast Asia reach and redundancy. Sao Paulo matters for South America and for regional performance and proximity. So the message here is not that every company needs the same footprint. The message is that global consistency is only useful when it comes with local placement options and practical control. That, to me, is where NetActuate fits the moment very well. Because the market does not just need more locations. It needs more flexible architecture across locations. This slide is really about speaking to the way that CEOs, CTOs, CFOs, and legal teams hear the problem. Storage design is now a business model decision. It affects revenue. It affects user experience. It affects regulatory exposure. It affects cloud spend and unit economics. And it affects how much optionality the company keeps as markets and requirements change. So if I were sitting in a board or executive meeting, the 3 questions I would ask are these. First, where can this workload and its related metadata actually live? Second, who can access it, administer it, decrypt, or replicate it? And third, what happens legally and technically when it fails over? Those 3 questions pull the conversation out of product marketing language and into operational reality. And they also help align the room, because now finance, legal, and product and engineering are all talking about the same thing. What is the business outcome? What is the risk envelope? And what operating model are we actually committing to? I would make this slide memorable because this is where a lot of organizations recognize themselves. Most global storage failures are governance failures in disguise. The storage engine is often fine. What breaks is everything around it. Primary data is local, but backups replicate to the wrong jurisdiction. Logs and telemetry contain regulated or sensitive data and travel globally by default. The disaster recovery design does not match the residency promise made in the contract. Administrative access crosses borders in ways the customer never expected. Or AI and analytics pipelines start training on data that was only supposed to be handled locally. None of these are small mistakes. They are structural blind spots. And they usually show up at the worst possible moment. During an outage, during a customer review, during procurement, during an audit. And that is why I frame this as a thought leadership rather than just a feature discussion. Because the real problem is not missing one checkbox. The real problem is designing a global platform without asking where the hidden control paths actually are. Once teams start asking that question early, they avoid a lot of painful surprises later. Okay, how to move forward. I wanted to close the core content with something simple and practical. 5 verbs. Classify, place, control, prove, and rehearse. So classify the workload and the data. Know what is sensitive, what is regulated, what can move, and what should not. Place the data. Metadata, backups, and logs intentionally. Do not let default settings become your architecture. Control. Who can access, administer, inspect, and replicate the environment? This is where sovereign design often succeeds or fails. Prove it. Make sure you can actually demonstrate the placement, the policy, the access controls, and the audit trail. And finally, rehearse. Run the failover, recovery, and support scenarios before a real event forces the question. I like this checklist because it works at both levels. Executive teams can remember it. Engineers can act on it. And it turns a very abstract conversation into an operating discipline. If a team can answer these 5 steps clearly, it's usually on the way to a much stronger global storage posture. So, let me leave you with one closing idea. The future of global infrastructure is not borderless. It is policy aware. The winners will be the teams that stay fast, stay regional where they need to, and keep policy and operations consistent everywhere else. That is a real balancing act. Not choosing between compliance and growth, not choosing between local control and global scale, but building an operating model that can do both. So thank you very much for your time. With that, I'm happy to take some questions and hopefully finish a little bit early. I've got to refresh my coffee. Let's see. Oh, looks like we have a few questions. All right. I'll just start picking these randomly here. Do we need a separate stack in every country or region? Usually, no. Most organizations do not need total duplication everywhere. What they need is policy-aware placement, stronger control boundaries, and a more intentional answer around access, keys, logging, backups, and failover. In other words, The answer is usually not one stack per country. It's a global platform with the right local boundaries where they matter the most. That keeps you more flexible and usually much more cost effective. Let's see. Does localizing storage always increase cost and complexity? It can if you localize everything without thinking about your workload design, but that's not the right model. The better model is to localize what truly needs to stay local, keep the right path and sensitive states close to users, and then standardize policy, automation, and observability globally. That way, you get control where it matters without creating a completely separate operating model in every market. So yes, there's some complexity, but good architecture contains that complexity instead of multiplying it. Oh, that's a good one. How should companies think about disaster recovery when data movement is restricted, especially in today's world? Disaster recovery has to be treated as both a resilience event and a compliance event. That means you design the failover policy before the outage, not during it. For some workloads, that means in-country or in-jurisdiction failover. For others, it could mean selective replication, approved transfer mechanisms, or stronger separation between regulated and non-regulated data. The key point is that the DR cannot be an afterthought. If your recovery plan breaks your residency or sovereignty commitments, then it's not really a complete recovery plan. All right, I think one more question. Why is this now a CEO or CFO conversation and not just a CTO conversation? Really, because storage placement now affects customer experience, market entry speed, risk, posture, audit readiness, and cost structure. So if you're spending heavily in centralized cloud environments, or if you're entering markets with stronger local expectations, then storage design directly affects your business outcome. So I would say this is no longer just a technical implementation detail. It's really a portfolio decision, a control decision. And in many cases, it's a growth decision. And I think this last one is from our marketing director, but why is NetActuate especially relevant in this discussion? Yeah, that's a good one. I would say because the answer is not just about selling storage. It's about how storage fits into a broader global operating model. NetActuate brings together network reach, regional deployment options, open infrastructure operations, tremendous Anycast experience, hybrid flexibility, and now globally deployable storage. And that combination matters because customers don't just need capacity. They need performance, placement, control, and optionality. And that is where a more open, globally distributed platform can be very compelling. All right, I think that wraps us up. Time to refill my coffee. Thanks again, everyone. Have a wonderful day.